You are all set, Commissioner Lance.
Thank you. Thank you. Today is Wednesday, September 22nd at 1:01 p.m. This is the City of Battle Creek, Michigan Airport Advisory Board meeting. And we would do a quick roll call for the members that are present. I'll just start with T.R. Shaw.
Present.
Vice Mayor Katie Ferris.
Present, attending remotely from Battle Creek.
That's right. If you could say if you're where you're located from, that'd be wonderful as well. T, are you in Battle Creek?
Yes, I'm in Battle Creek.
Joe Soborowski.
Present from Battle Creek, Michigan.
Tim Osterhaus.
Yeah, present at Battle Creek Airport.
And Kelly Scott.
Present, Battle Creek.
Okay. And then I know we have some other folks on here. Am I missing anyone else who are voting members? All right, I do believe we have a quorum. Okay, has everyone had a opportunity to review the agenda items for today? Your silence will mean yes, once I hear somebody say no.
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. All right, can I get a motion to approve the prior meeting minutes?
So moved.
Katie Ferris supports.
Okay, we have T.R. Shaw and Katie Ferris supporting. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none. Move on to item D, the old business. And we have governance review, and then update on governance review activities. Is Penny around?
Commissioner Lance, I think
Yes,
I think we skipped item C, approval of the minutes.
No, that's what we just approved.
Okay, I thought you had said agenda. Okay, so that was for the minutes as well. Okay.
Hi, Commissioner Lance. This is Penny. Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Are you going to provide any update on the governance review activities at this point?
Yes, I can give a quick review, although there is a lot in the presentation that we have later.
Well, then we'll save for that then if you'd like, if that's easier.
Sure, I can do that then.
Okay. Moving on to new business. So some of you saw we have some new dates. The time is not listed. Larry, are we suggesting that the time still be 1 p.m.?
That's correct. That's correct, sir.
Okay. Because of the lots of conflicts, we decided to change the dates. I'm seeing that we have some there. Are there any objections to the alternative dates? Does anyone have any comments on that? Hearing none, can we get a motion to approve the new dates?
Sorry, 1 second.
Commissioner Lance, this is Penny again. I would just note that in January, there are 2 suggested dates. So just to decide which one of those works best for people.
Okay. Does anybody have a preference for the January 19th, 2022? I'm sorry, the 20th or the 26th for the January meetings in 2022? My preference is the 20th.
All right, I move to adopt the suggested dates as presented to include January 20th for the January meeting.
Any support?
Katie Ferris support.
It's been moved and supported. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. So that will we'll update everyone's schedule with that. Okay. The next one is the governance review.
Yeah, hi, thank you. This is Penny. So we have a lot of information today. I know we only have an hour, so I will try to move through it as quickly as possible. But if people have questions along the way, please feel free to ask. And then, obviously we would anticipate a more robust discussion, once we finish the presentation. Okay, Larry, next slide, please. So just to give a summation what we're doing, we researched the history of the governance model and the changes from the inception to date. So we will go over that. We have conducted extensive stakeholder surveys. We have interviewed at this point a total of 31 people, and that includes the advisory board members, the technical subcommittee members, all airport direct employees, it's people from the city, members of BCU, et cetera, tenants, the Meat and Hut. So we have a really nice, diverse background of people from different, perspectives who've all discussed, their backgrounds and their dealings with the airport and the city and their perceptions of it. So we're going to give a summary of the highlights and most important things that came out of that. Then to follow up on our discussion from last meeting, we are going to go a little more in depth into the models that are available for governance options here, and really talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the models and the models that we think are most viable for you to really make your choice from. And then to follow that up, then we're going to discuss in general what are the perceptions of regional authorities and how that is the industry trend that many airports are moving toward, and just so you can get a sense of that and how that might apply here at Battle Creek. Okay, thank you. So the governance, the history of the governance models, the airport was, came into being in 1924. It opened as the Battle Creek Airport in 1925. And then in 1928, after significant investment, it was renamed the W.K. Kellogg Airport. At that time, it was created by the Chamber of Commerce originally. So very interesting that, the business community decided that, air transportation was the wave of the future, and they wanted to make sure that Battle Creek was, had a part in that. In 36, the airport was, given by Kellogg to the city of Battle Creek. And it also, the name changed again to Battle Creek Kellogg Airport. It continued with the city until 1942 during the Second World War, and the entire airport was leased to the Army, and all civilian activity was suspended. In 1944, the city created a planning commission, an airport committee. Obviously, I think in anticipation of the war ending and the city regaining, control of the airport. Next slide, please. And also an important date was 1945. And that's when the Michigan law was passed and created the category of political subdivisions, airports, and that is what you are currently now operating as, a political subdivision of the state of New York owned by the city of Battle Creek itself being the political subdivision that's referenced. I'm so sorry, Michigan, this political subdivision of Michigan that's referenced in the legislation. In 1947, Kellogg Field was restored to full civilian use again, and the Battle Creek Airport Board was created by the city commission as an entity to actually operate the airport. It was in this time period, 47, 48, was renamed W.K. Kellogg Regional Airfield, and the city officially received the deed back to the airport from the federal government in 1948. That board that the city created operated the airport until 1953. Until the city dissolved the board and the airport became a part of this public affairs department of the city. Following that, so really that has been the governance model from 1953 until the present. During that time, between the 50s and today, the city has created airport advisory boards, which have served for a while and then been dissolved. And, that history is a little murky, and the precise dates of when those advisory boards were functioning is not precisely documented. We would also note that in 1969, there was a referendum on the ballot to create a regional airport. And at that time, between Battle Creek and Kalamazoo, and voters turned that down. And then that leads us to the present, where we are with the city as a owner and operator of the airport, and reinstituting the advisory board this year as part of our activities with the governance study, and obviously with the land development. Okay. So if there are no questions or discussion about that, I'll just move on to the stakeholder input. Next slide, please. So again, we interviewed 31 people from all aspects of the stakeholder community. In general, the overwhelming sort of idea that came out of it was that the general public doesn't really know much about the airport in general, really doesn't know much about the airport's governance, specifically that the airport is owned and operated by the city, and also that they don't understand the importance of the airport, its economic impact, the number of jobs it sustains, and actually the kind of economic engine that it is. So there was a general consensus also from after, acknowledging these things or pointing them out, that, the sense of public education would be very, very valuable to let the community really start to understand the importance of the airport, and, a little more of who's out here, what it does, et cetera. Let's see. Also, in general, the perception was that, the city is obviously supportive of the airport, quite supportive, and it, constantly does its best to support the airport. But it is sometimes a challenge to respond as efficiently as the airport needs. And obviously, the airport is just one item, one structure, one department, under the city, which has, many other items and departments to focus on. We see with this in general that this is the kind of thing that something like a regional and authority board could provide, or even a more distinct operating board could provide. But, really just someone to be a champion and an advocate of the airport that can really focus on the airport as its sole mission. So there are different mechanisms for that, but that was something that really came out too in the stakeholder input. And also I would just want to make sure people understand this summary of the stakeholder input. This is what came from people that we spoke with. This is not SBA's opinion, or our, thoughts about this. We're just kind of mirroring back the highlights of what people said. So just want to please keep that in mind. Next slide, Larry, please. Thank you. Sometimes the airport administrative and operational needs, given that it's this, federally regulated, very tightly regulated entity that serves, both as economic engine, but also as a public good, sometimes those needs do not integrate, smoothly with the city processes. And this has to do with the aviation regulations and rules and standards that in general, are not understood by the public and sometimes by the city itself. As an example of that was brought up to us, where the HR and union processes can be constraining for the airport, to sometimes officially hire competent staff that has specific aviation experience. And also, in general, there was a sense from the stakeholders that, something needs to change, that you're at a critical point, in history and in the development of the town and the airport's, mission, so that, something has to change in order to make the airport really solid and sustainable in a consistent and ongoing way. So there's a very consistent sense out there of that. Many stakeholders expressed their openness to a governance change, particularly to an authority, especially if it can help with the growth and the stability of the airport. Obviously, they're interested in learning more and finding out how and why that could happen. Some stakeholders have a concern regarding the airport having a more independent life through an authority structure, for instance, in terms of its financing structures, and would it be able to actually be viable and sustainable on its own without support from the city? And some stakeholders had questions regarding how the move to a different operating system, governance system, particularly an authority, might affect them or might impact their business's viability in terms of increased costs, et cetera. Okay, next slide. And finally, there was again just an overwhelming sense of that the stakeholders really understand the significant benefits that the airport provides and how an authority might be able to enhance that. And overall, it's understood that having a stable airport run efficiently by a board that's focused solely on the airport with members who are very educated about aviation issues, particularly that this would be very beneficial for the airport. There are a lot of state and federal regulations, and particularly about the land that the airport is on and the federal grant obligations that it is encumbered by and has to meet. So there are very complicated issues in terms of running an airport, and it would benefit from having people who understood those issues and are familiar with them. There was also a strong sense from stakeholders that, the airport, provides a lot of value to the community, but that it also was this untapped, jewel that, has the potential to provide even more value. And in general, all stakeholders were obviously supportive of the airport and just want to see it flourish and grow. This obviously we have done other activities, obviously, in addition to the stakeholder interviews. We've been doing deep dives into the finances, and we're in the process of finalizing our financial report. We've also been doing deep dives into the organizational and administrative structures and workings of the airport, and obviously this legislative review and the legal deep dive in terms of governance structures itself. So these are the other background activities that are feeding into what our initial findings are. So between the stakeholder interviews, the sense that we've gotten from the community, and the financial, organizational, legal, and economic analysis we've done, excuse me, the initial findings that we have to report is that the airport absolutely would benefit from some kind of focused and dedicated board that operates it. And you need people on that board who have knowledge and education about how airports work and the aviation industry, and that board would be, the champion of the airport to help guide it. Now, in this sense, we're using operating board in kind of a generic sense, and as we'll discuss more in depth with the legislative piece, there are different ways to create these types of dedicated operating boards. But anyway, if that were to come about, the airport would definitely experience more efficiency in its processes. And this, I think, would apply, system-wide to the airport for all of its activities, from HR to the land development to the revenue generation, such as setting rates and charges, landing fees, hangars, et cetera, to being able to be more nimble and more aggressive in business development and marketing, and just have their internal processes be more streamlined and functional without having to match up with city processes. And that in turn would lead to better hiring practices, training, professional development, being able to recruit and retain staff of more capable, of high caliber that you could draw from all over the country. So that is definitely, our finding and what we want to discuss. Next slide, please. There are lots of examples from that operational efficiencies that could be created with a dedicated operating board, we'll just take leasing as one example. So the airport has created new leases and has been instituting them as leases come up. But there still are several leases, including, all the T-hangar tenants, that these leases were signed originally many, many years ago, and they have language that's not consistent with industry standards. So this is, a process where, if the airport had more independence, it could go about, creating the type of leases that could specifically identify what the services are, what the charges are, what the tenant's responsible for, what the airport is responsible for, that would really match industry language and standards. Yeah, and there are some concerns about would this make the current tenants less willing to invest in the airport? So that's something you'd have to look at. But currently the result of it is the airport is probably earning less operating fees than it can, and that's part of the support that the city makes up for. So that's just one example of type of operational efficiencies. Also, given the stakeholder overwhelming discussion about the sort of lack of knowledge of the general public regarding what an asset the airport is, it was determined that an economic impact study would be really helpful to really precisely define this. And so that's something that came out of our study, and that has been approved, and it's currently in process. And I think, Spencer, you have an update on that, correct?
I do. Thank you. So we worked with Larry and the city to bring on Grand Valley State University to perform the economic impact study. That's going to really look into some of the details of the airport itself and how it's benefiting the community economically. So for some of the tenants that are on the board and a part of the committee, we'll be reaching out to you soon to connect you with Grand Valley. To gather some information related to the number of jobs that you have and employ, to come up with that overall impact for the airport.
Okay, great. Thank you, Spencer. Next slide, please. So now we wanted to get into more detail to follow up from our presentation from last month about the advantages and disadvantages. And again, we would just remind you, as we did last month, to keep some of the questions in mind, in terms of how to decide what model is best for the airport's operation today. One question is about taxes. Another question is about how much control you want on being able to name the board, among other issues. And again, it came, we discussed, and it came up last week, the potential of, partnering with another jurisdiction or another political subdivision, and what are the risks and benefits of such a partnership. Okay, next slide. And we also just want to make sure, this is something that we talk to, we emphasize in every study that we do. There may be multiple models that could serve adequately to run the airport, and that all, the model that you choose depends upon the circumstances in your local environment. But no model in itself guarantees success. So even if you decide to change to, let's say a regional authority or an operating board under the city, that, there still are issues that will come up and that will have to be, looked at, and, a plan created to approach them and solve them. So the model itself doesn't guarantee the success of the airport. We want to recap from last time. We think that there are actually 4 potentially viable options available to you to choose from. One is to create a regional authority. And, we'll go into that. We talked about that last time, what that is, the powers of that, and we'll discuss that, the pros and cons below. The second is to modify your current model. So currently the city owns and operates the airport, and all the decision-making goes through the airport management to the city decision makers, now with input from an advisory board. The modification that's allowed under the legislation is that you would actually create an operating board. So it wouldn't be an advisory board. It would be a board that was specifically created to set up and run the airport. So in that sense, it's similar to an independent board that would be created under a regional Airport Authority, but the city would still own the airport, and the city would appoint all of the people on that board. So that's an option. And we believe those are the two strongest options available to you. You know, legally, what also is available to you is to create a joint operating board, but that would have to be in conjunction with another political subdivision. The city would have to join with a partner, or to create a community authority, which again is an independent body, but again, the city would only be able to do that in conjunction with another entity. So now we're going to look at the pros and cons of each of these models, these 4 models. So this is just a recap of what a regional authority is. The city would have to agree to create it as the owner, and the board appointments would be made by the city, given by the constraints of the legislation. There could be no more than 45% elected officials on the board. There is a requirement for a regional member in order to expand the perspective. And board members would have to meet certain criteria for qualifications, you know, again, in terms of education and knowledge in fields that would positively help the airport: finance, marketing, aviation, business, law, etc. This is a model that does not allow the regional authority itself to be able to impose a tax. And the pros and cons of this model. Okay, yeah, go ahead. The next slide, please. Thanks, Larry. So, you know, in general.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt? What does that mean by not be able to levy? So maybe you're going to get into it, but you know, how do they operate?
Yeah, no, it just means that the authority itself can't tax local citizens to raise money.
Okay.
Yeah, which is not something that the city does now anyway. It's something the city could do. It could impose a tax and the money raised by that particular tax could go to support the airport, but that's not what is happening now.
Okay, well, I'll let you finish. Maybe we'll want to come back to that as you get through this. Maybe it'll answer my question. So.
Sure, no problem. Regional authorities are set up specifically to help airports act independently, and therefore it allows them to have a more entrepreneurial and a business focus in general, because the authority is the direct operator and owner of the airport. It's more efficient and effective in terms of policies and procedures. It also reflects industry best practices, which is why more and more airports are moving to that model. This airport would have greater zoning control on the property owned by the airport. It would also be able to buy and sell the property. And the legislation around this, because it's recent, this is the most recent legislation, it's very clear, and it specifically addresses items so that there's no confusion. It's a good legislative model. Because it really precisely defines things. It's as just discussed, you must have regional representation to get that regional perspective. There's criteria for board membership. There's a limitation of how many elected officials can have, and that it helps to reduce political influence and conflicts of interest. You know, it's transparent, it's public, and the airport does have the ability to issue bonds. Okay, so debt vehicles. The disadvantages of this is that the airport cannot levy taxes. The legislation states so explicitly. All of the liability is held by the authority. It doesn't share it with anyone. And if the authority comes into existence and there's previous debt, they have to decide how to manage that. And the expectation is that the authority is able to be financially self-supporting. And if that's not available, or if that's not possible at the beginning, then the city would still need to support the airport until it was able to create additional revenue and be able to support itself. And so disadvantage is if the city would be willing to do that or not. Okay.
So this is Larry Penny. So Joe, just to maybe get back to your question, this is the model that Traverse City, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Spencer, but Traverse City and both Grand Rapids are using. Is that correct?
That is correct, Larry.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's also the model that several other airports in Michigan have approached us about. So, you know, many airports are looking at this option right now. In your state alone. The second viable option is to maintain the current model of governance you have, but modify it by having the city create a direct operating board that would actually manage the airport and create processes, procedures that are different from city processes, that are independent from city processes. And decision-making would be with that board and would not be going back to the city board of commissioners or the city council, right? Okay. But that board would have oversight of the airport directly. This has some of the similar advantages to the regional regional authority, and also some slightly different. So one advantage that's different is it retains the sort of political and working relationships that already exist, and it, you know, again, would provide direct oversight of the airport and also accountability to the city by the city appointing all the members of the board. The city would retain control of the buying and selling of the property, but would be advised by the board. And city properties priorities can still be reflected by the composition of the board that it chooses. The city still retains the ability to levy taxes should it choose in order to support airport operations and help balance the budget. And in general, it allows for more efficient oversight by the city by kind of, you know, quote unquote, outsourcing the direct operation and management to a designated and, you know, sort of quasi-independent board. The liabilities for this model is that the city still retains all the liability associated with the airport. The legal and the services would still be that are being used today by the airport. They would still be needed to be provided by the city. The city still would remain responsible for any financial support that was necessary in terms of balancing the operating budget. And the airport's processes still would not be completely independent and still may be stymied in some sense in terms of its ability to be as entrepreneurial or nimble in business as might be most ideal.
This is Larry again. So Penny, I have a question, then I have just a couple of extra bits of information to offer the board. So my question is this: under the regional authority model, the authority itself does not have the capability to levy a tax. However, in that case, the supporting agencies could levy a tax. For example, the city of Battle Creek could levy a millage in support of the airport. Is that correct?
Yes, that is absolutely correct.
Okay,
The
so while
airport itself cannot do it, but the city, even though it wasn't the owner and the operator, could still levy a tax to raise money to balance the airport's budget. Yes.
okay, and then I guess what I wanted to offer for the benefit of the board members is this particular model, this model where you develop an operating board out of the political subdivision form of governance, is what Traverse City moved away from. They had a multi-county situation. They had two counties involved, and they had gone to a board, but the big sticking point for them was when they started trying to bring Costco to that area on airport property. They had a lot of inefficiencies, and so that was enough to really push them to move towards the regional authority. And then I do believe that this is the model that Kalamazoo County and the city of Kalamazoo went with several years ago. They were desirous to develop a regional authority, but they were unable to get that done. And so they went with this particular model.
Yes, thank you, Larry. Both of those things are absolutely true. You know, and we're working with Traverse City, and this is exactly the model that they had that they wanted to move away from, precisely because it still was constraining in terms of their ability to be, nimble and entrepreneurial and create more revenue with the land that they have. So, and that's why that's why we thought it was important to mention in the advantages for the authority about that zoning control, because that was exactly a major issue, with, for example, Traverse City. Yeah. Okay. If there's no more discussion, we'll go on to the next model. The next model is the joint operating board. So it's similar to the city creating an operating board, but in this case, the city would have to find a willing partner, and it would have to be a jurisdiction that actually borders the airport in order to create an operating board between the two entities. Okay. And the next slide, the pros and cons of this. The advantages are it gives even greater representation, since you have more than one political subdivision entity being represented and on the board. The liability of the airport would be shared between entities. The services that are contracted out, legal, et cetera, could HR could then be supplied by either or both of the entities. The financial support might be easier, since you would have two instead of one entities to look for in terms of helping to balance a budget. There would be additional political connections and support, in theory. And again, the airport would have direct oversight by this board and not be encumbered by one particular city or the other city's internal processes. The disadvantages of this is that the city would actually have to spend time and resources and education to find a partner who was willing to do this. And then once you have a partner, there's a potential for disputes or disagreements or difference in priorities or difference in ways to handle particular policies, et cetera, between the two entities now who both have ownership equally. And then there's a potential loss for the city of some or a majority of control to the partner that is brought in. Another disadvantage is that the property could not be bought and sold through this entity. It would still need to go back to Battle Creek for approval. There is the potential political influence. So now you have more jurisdictions and more potential for that. It's probably even less efficient, because now you have to have all decisions made from two different perspectives of two different political subdivisions. And sponsors have other priorities besides the airport that they are looking at and managing. And again, as Larry mentioned, this is exactly the model that Traverse City moves away from. They were owned by two counties, and the two counties did sometimes have very different perspectives on issues that would come up. Okay. Next slide. And then the final is very similar to that, the joint board we just discussed, except instead of a board owned by entities, it would be an independent authority. So you could create a community authority, which again, the city would have to find a willing partner to do that with. And if you go to the next slide, please, the pros and cons again are very, very similar. Pros, greater regional representation. As an authority, this one does have the ability to levy taxes from the two jurisdictions, one, the other, or both. As an independent authority that's solely responsible for the airport, it's a little more easy for it to follow the industry best practices. You have the ability to set criteria for membership so that you would get expertise and education, people who understood aviation. And the airport, again, as the regional authority, would have the ability to issue bonds, to basically borrow and issue debt. The disadvantages are the same. They're very similar. City would have to find a willing partner. There's potential for disputes, and there's a potential for loss of control. And in this case, because of the authority, the city itself can no longer underwrite the bonds. So those are the four models that we believe are, available to you. But of those four models, we think the regional authority or the modification of your current system make the most sense, just because we've seen in other cases that when you bring in a second jurisdictional partner, things get very complicated very quickly. So, I would open it up to discussion now. We've, talked about this for 2 months in a row, and I just, like to hear what you think about each other's thoughts.
Thank you, Penny. I really appreciate the presentation. I guess we're opening up to everyone. I mean, does it make sense from a logistics standpoint that we eliminate one, if not two, governance models today, so that we can really focus on two to give us probably the best option? I guess I leave that up to discussion, but that would be my preference, so that we can really get down to what we need to do.
I would agree with that, Commissioner Lance. This is Kara. I think if we can eliminate it to the two most probable, then we can start looking at what is the most, what are challenges and not.
You're right, Kara?
Darn FedEx.
Do any committee members have any objections or comments to Kara or my comments?
This is Andy Richards with Duncan Aviation. Thanks for allowing me to join the meeting. Not on the board, so I'll make my statement as a community member and a member of the airport. I think it's a good idea to narrow down the focus. Once that's done, however, I'll kind of lead into my next point. I think it would be helpful to the board in making their decision if the airport could build out a business model or business case, whatever you want to call it, for each of the two remaining models, and then compare those and contrast those to the current model and how the airport is running as far as where it gets its funding, where its funding goes, how efficient they are with that funding, and how much more efficient they could be in the future under one of these new models that you're considering today and you will be considering in the future. I think that would be very helpful to have those data points in front of you, Commissioner Lance.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's been my kind of concern in all this, is how do we fund the airport? And I think funding is going to be an issue. Just FYI, I had a conversation with Gil Culver, who is the chair of the Kalamazoo board, who basically said they went to a regional authority we're two different airports. We don't have, I just asked him how it's funded. And he said his biggest source of income in Kalamazoo is parking, but that's not going to be an issue with us. But they also have a strong federal presence that we don't have too. They've got DHS and TSA because of the airline, plus they have airline support in. But their model, when they changed to that, it was county and they went to the authority, but a county person stayed on their board. So they do have a connection with the county, but it really opened up the board to some really pretty good people and really, people that had a lot of interest in this that weren't necessarily connected to the local political scene. But it's just one of those points I just want to make about the regional authority.
Yeah, I want to build on that too, because I think the ability to pay bills, I know we're modeling after other airports, but I know Traverse City has passenger travel. Some of the other airports referenced do. We don't necessarily have that. So I don't think it's a apples to oranges kind of comparison, or apples to apples. It's apples to oranges, because we're a little bit different and we've been funded differently over the past 20 years. So I think I agree narrowing it down, but long-term funding stability needs to be taken into account.
and that raises the question, if I could ask, maybe Penny could comment on just quickly here too. The idea that those that have been moving to a regional authority, and I know Larry talked a little bit about Grand Rapids and Traverse City, for example, and I know Penny, you said there are multiple other airports that have or are looking at moving to a regional authority, but it's predicated in some notion on the fact that they'd be financially self-sustaining. And I'm curious if you're aware of the conditions in either Traverse City or Grand Rapids relative to that, or, are there examples of regional authorities that may not be self-sustaining but have adopted that model and are receiving some support funding, perhaps from another organization?
I think that's a really good question. And the financial piece is obviously key to this. And, on the schedule next month is for the October meeting is where we are going to present a lot of details about the finances. So, and Andy, I think it's a really good idea to kind of try to map out the different models as much as possible and to look at the comparison. But to answer your question, Ted, I think an example that is probably the closest apple-to-apple comparison with Battle Creek is St. Cloud. So we worked with them extensively for a year to do a review, and they have, they basically are a GA airport with a couple of charter flights. So they do have some service, but they do not have like regularly scheduled commercial service, except to a few destinations on a very, very limited basis. And they also are an airport that's owned by a city, and they also are an airport that has a significant operational budget deficit. And so they are in the process of also changing to a regional authority. And as part of that, we mapped out a very detailed financial plan for them about how over the course of 10 years, they could reduce and then eventually eliminate their budget, and how the city over the course of those same 10 years would commit to, maintaining its support, and the support would be gradually increased as the airport gradually increased its revenues. So that's a model the city's, willing to, sign off on the, application to become a regional authority, but at the same time is still giving commitment to support the airport while this transitional phase is taking place. And one of the key things that I think really convinced the local stakeholders in that situation was that we also commissioned an economic impact study, and there had been one done, fairly recently, less than 10 years before, but we found even in that 6 to 7 years, the new study showed that the airport's impact had doubled in size, so that they were able to really educate the business community and the surrounding stakeholders that this was an incredible asset, produced an enormous amount of economic input in their community, and it was absolutely worth the city's investment of, again, under $1 million, but a significant part of its operating budget to support the airport while it was in that transitional phase to be sustainable on its own.
Yeah, this is Larry. I think that's going to be really important as well, because you think of all the things we subsidize in this city. As a community, we agree that there are certain things that need to be subsidized, but very rarely do we look at the economic impact of what we're subsidizing. I think as we look closer at what Grand Valley State produces, and again, I'm biased. I've been here a long time. I think there's a tremendous amount of value in what the airport's providing. Having said that, our goal, and it's the charge from the FAA, because they don't want to have to put any more AIP funds into an airport than they have to. But our goal with our rates and fees, our charges, is to be as self-sufficient as possible. And I think the SBA financial report will at least allude to our ability to be self-sustaining. But I can tell you this, I don't think the airport is very far from being self-sustaining from an operational perspective. Now, from a capital basis, grant matches and maybe some larger outright purchases of snow removal equipment, that dialogue needs to take place. But I think the airport has undoubtedly the potential to be self-sustaining from an operational perspective, irregardless of air carrier service. That tends to be a real misnomer in this industry. People think, oh, you don't have airlines, you can't possibly be anything. We're talking about the third busiest airport in the state of Michigan right now. And again, I think when the economic data comes out, that might provide a little more reassurance that the airport can actually stand on its own 2 feet eventually.
Would be interesting to know too. I mean, an analysis of timing could be very interesting here, right? Because the question might be, for those that have successfully, let's say, converted to a regional authority, were they converting right about the time they were becoming self-sufficient, or did they convert and that led to self-sufficiency? So I would kind of be curious, about an analysis of timing and what, how that might play into a decision.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And one of our stakeholders, mentioned this, and I'm sorry, I forget exactly who it was, but the idea that that there's a deficit that the city is putting funds into, and that's not any different than the city supporting any other activity, whether it's fire or police. These other activities that the city puts money into are not necessarily producing an economic value, but they're producing a very high, social good, public good. And that's really kind of the perspective that needs to be taken, even if the city were to, move to a regional authority, and even if the airport were to move to an authority, and the city still made a commitment for, giving support to the airport until it achieved that safe self-sustainability. It's not wasted money. It's money that's, enhancing the public good. And then we'll get real numbers, real dollar numbers once the economic impact study is done. And you can see in St. Cloud, we did this, for every dollar that the city invested in the airport, it literally got like thousands of dollars in economic input as a ROI, return on investment. So, I think there are different ways to kind of frame these arguments to really kind of show what the value is here.
Really a legitimate point. Some of the challenge we have here too, right, is that traditional funding source might be drying up. And so that's the issue.
Yeah, that might be information that Steve Bush, who handles the financial aspects for SBA, would be good to get in his hands, Penny, if in fact, if the TIFA goes away and the entire capture goes away, or does it a portion of that go back to the city of Battle Creek? I don't claim to understand that, but that might be something that Steve Bush needs to understand, so that can be incorporated into this discussion.
Yes, absolutely. And internally, we have had those discussions. And so, Steve and also Alex, who does our legal review, we would love to have, additional conversations with you or Ted or whoever is appropriate to really understand more that TIFA connection and what the financial and legal relationship or limitations would be under these two different, models that we've been talking about. A regional authority or an operating board from the city. So I agree. I think that's key, and we need to get more information about that.
Is there any other discussion? So, as I understand it, are we moving? You're going to provide some financials, obviously, that will help us, I guess, compare to the new models that we're looking at. But we're looking at potentially a regional authority, as well as, I guess, a joint governance model with not a community model, but with a governance model with the city of Battle Creek.
Well, Larry, if you go to the next slide, oh no, I'm sorry. Maybe there's okay, yeah, the slide, sorry. So, after our initial analysis and looking at this and looking at what we've seen in other cases, that the partnering with the two different jurisdictions, we see more risk in those scenarios than we see benefits. And so, if you're asking our opinion, and I've heard you saying, other people saying, let's, consider, sort of whittling this down, to two viable options. If you're asking for our opinion, we would say the two most viable options are the regional airport authority and the modification to what you have now, city-owned, but with an operating board. And if you're asking for financial projections about models, I also think that those two models would be the most important to get, financial comparisons of. That the models with the joint ones are more difficult actually to predict, because you're not just dealing with city finances and airport finances. Now you have to, forecast some third party, and at this point, that's totally hypothetical. You don't know who that third party is, and you don't know if they'd be willing. So
my input would be, I'm just going to jump in there if you're asking for my opinion, would be option 2, because that's kind of status quo with a board. That's, and then I think you still need to throw in an option of where there's opportunity to levy, which would be 4. Mine would be 2 and 4.
Is that based on a previous slide you saw then, Joe, when you say number 2?
Yeah, I think if you go back to the 4 options that we started with, the only reason I say that is regional authority, the two that you have laid out there are kind of this, to basically get to the same outcome. I think we need to explore 2 outcomes.
The regional authority is very different from option 2. And it's also very different from option 4. The regional authority is just the city making appointments to an authority board, but the community authority, you have to have 2 entities. So the city would have to find an entity to do
I understand that, yeah. And I think I think 1 and 2 really doesn't answer the question about future funding. Now, I know we can put a 10-year plan where it gets it to self-sustaining. That's why I would choose 2 and 4. This is just my opinion.
Joe, so under 4, do you have a suggested community partner?
I think that's, don't we have the county on the call here? Don't we have other municipalities on the call?
Kelly Scott is here, and I don't think Bester. I think there's really only 2 options. Would be City of Springfield, or it would be the Calhoun County.
Right. So my point is, why are they participating? If we're not going to explore that, I'm not saying it's the right answer.
So why don't we look at 1, 2, and 4 then? I don't think anybody's particularly looking at 3.
And is that because 3 doesn't have the ability to levy a tax then?
Principally.
Because 3 and 4 are very similar.
Yeah.
All right, so Penny, does that make sense to you then?
Well, I think what makes more sense is to talk about that is like levying a tax. Is that important? Because
I think we have to understand what the implications, the benefits and rewards of that, what that is, what those are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is right, Joe. I think from Joe's perspective, and Joe, don't let me speak for you, but we have to look at traditionally how we've operated over the last several decades, right? Which has been relying on a subsidy from the TIFA. This year, we happen to be committing some city funds to help support operations, but that's been the operating model for quite a while. I think we're all pretty confident. We're confident that the airport can generate enough revenue on its own to be self-sustaining with some key development taking place. But we know that the operating model isn't going to change tomorrow. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, maybe some of the funding support is becoming less available. And so I think from BCU's perspective, and probably the cities as well, understanding what it means to have another dedicated source of revenue to support the airport, given what we know historically has happened there, is something worth exploring. I think that, Joe, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I sense that's what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what, that's why I feel like 4 is worth exploring. I'm not saying that 1 or 2 is the worst, but creating authority, but still having that funding question mark out there, I think it's important to explore.
Yeah, and I would think, this is Larry again, I would think it's important, Penny, to point out what would happen if we did nothing. Because the liability is not going away.
If you did nothing, if we go through the study and you decide just to keep the city as the
Right.
operator.
Let's just say that the funding source today dries up.
Mhm.
That's the TIFA. What does the city of Battle Creek intend on doing with their airport?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. That's not a question that we can necessarily answer, but the point of the study is, to see what are the mechanisms to allow the airport to remain in operation and how to do that most efficiently. And ideally, can the airport operate on a more self-sufficient basis, right? And the forms of government that you choose definitely impact the airport's ability to achieve self-sustainability potentially. So we could do the study and you could choose to do nothing. And the pros and cons of that is, well, you've had a lot of discussion and you have a lot of information and analysis that we've done at your disposal, and then maybe the city would consider revamping some internal processes with or without an operating board to make the airport's operation more efficient. So that's one result that could happen. Obviously that is up to internal stakeholders to decide, but I think in some ways to go through a process like this and then decide to stay the same is a little bit of an exercise that doesn't really give you all the benefit of the analysis that's done. I think so. If you want to explore this community option more, you also have to realize that takes place in terms of having to have further discussions, having further meetings and interviews, and to find willing partners. And that's going to add time and cost to the whole process. So, that's fine as long as you have the appetite for an increased budget to do that sort of thing. And as long as, that schedule, you're comfortable with that expanding. So, and then you may go down that avenue, and your options are you may find a willing partner that you're going to work with well, or you may expend time, money, and resources to try to find a partner and you don't find that. And so then you're back to, okay, so that's, you cross that option off. And maybe that's a process that you want to go through, absolutely. But
yeah, and I have a question. So I just want to make sure that we understand what the options are for the city in terms of finding a partner. We might as well get to brass tacks. It's either Calhoun County or the city of Springfield. Is that correct? Or does Kalamazoo County, Ted, you might know this, does Kalamazoo County touch any of the airport property?
Larry, I should add it regarding the bordering. It's not the bordering of the airport. In Traverse City, for instance, Leelanau County itself doesn't border the airport. It borders Grand Traverse County. So just a point of clarification.
Okay, so I think it's important for this group. I don't want to spin our wheels. I think the group needs to understand if the consensus is, hey, let's look at creating a community authority, who is it that they need to reach out to, or we need to reach out to to have that discussion? And are they, I kind of thought they were already part of this group with City of Springfield and in Calhoun County. Maybe I'm missing a partner, maybe I'm not.
Larry, I'd like to ask a question of Joe. Joe, I know you have to jump off, you just texted that, but hopefully you can stick around for this question. If we want to go, if you're suggesting we go with this community airport authority and investigate it, do you think we're going to find, and you're wanting to do that for the reason of maintaining the ability to levy taxes, that was one of the things you said. Do you think we'll find a partner who's more willing to levy taxes than the city of Battle Creek? I mean, it's just I know it's a rhetorical question partly, but is that the assumption you're making?
Well, I would just say historically, this community and county has levied taxes on a lot of things. We just passed a county parks mill. And I'm not saying that that's the route. I'm just saying I think it needs to be explored, and I don't think that we need to enter into another contract per se, but we need to have that explored of what the steps would be to get to there. I think that would be part of I think our current scope, but I don't know. All I'm saying is the first two, you may have an individual board, whether it be appointed by the city or a regional authority, you still haven't solved the long-term funding solution.
Could I add a little bit more onto that with Joe? If we investigated number 4 and talked about levying a tax, could it be a transportation tax? So we're in the middle of the pilot program for the countywide transportation authority. Could that be something that could also go towards that and do duplicate services between the airport and transportation needs within the county? Because then it would actually probably enhance the connection with the county of, Calhoun County. So just another thought.
This is Kelly. I am here. I feel sort of like people are expecting me to say something. I think so definitely I'm here on behalf of the county and happy to talk about, some community authority, if that's the right answer. I think the key is, so each different authorities, like the public transit authority is its own statute. So they have the ability, if we created a countywide transportation authority, it comes with the independent ability to levy taxes under certain provisions. And so I think they would have to be separate, but I like the idea. And then I think the key is what I'm hearing is you either have a community authority that can levy taxes. And by the way, I'm not clear whether that requires a vote of the people or they can just levy a tax. And if you have a regional authority or the current model, the city of Battle Creek could still levy taxes and direct them to the airport. So I think in all of the cases we're talking about, there's the ability to infuse property tax funds under, I just don't know. I'm guessing under all of those scenarios, it would require being put on the ballot as an extra voted millage that the people would have to vote on. So I think that's one thing we just need clarification. The process to levy taxes might actually be pretty similar to our voters under all those scenarios. And, again, yes, I'm here on behalf of the county, and if we're the logical partner, we would be happy to work on that.
This is Alex Hobson with Steve Baldwin Associates. I'll say in regard to number 4, creating a community authority, the idea is it's very similar to forming a joint venture or limited liability partnership, where each member or constituent member of the authority will come in and they make a contribution, and their voting power and their power on their board and their seats on their board is directly related to the percentage of this authority that they have contributed to. Their contribution may behind the scenes come from actual taxing authority. So whether it's the county and the city of Battle Creek, they come in. Those two entities can go back to their tax base and raise taxes in order to get their contribution. But within the structure itself, that's how the law or it's legally kind of organized. Under the regional authority, And it may be semantics, just as the lady who was speaking before me was saying before. As you form a brand new entity in the regional authority, that entity does not in and of itself have the ability to actually go out and levy taxes. Now, if behind the scenes, those that compose a regional authority can pass by voter resolution or anything else, the ability to go out and raise taxes. But it as an entity under the current standing law doesn't have the ability to raise taxes by itself. Hope that clarifies a few things.
Right, but then none of these, Alex, this is Larry, none of them preclude the stakeholders and the partners in the airport itself from providing a revenue stream to offset a subsidy while they still need that help. Is that correct? None of them preclude that, right?
That's correct.
And Alex, I think we would have to research this, but what about these potential taxes being levied? Are they all, would they all have to be voter approved, or would any of these different entities allow that without voter approval?
Typically, they go back. If you're looking at a kind of joint jurisdiction, either operating board or an authority, each jurisdiction or each component part has to go back to their tax base and get it approved and voted on. The ones that I have seen, there are limits on what the millage rate and stuff can be when they go back and do that, but it does require approval from the tax basis.
Okay, thanks.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, but thank you for clarifying that.
Larry, I'm gonna kind of go out on a limb here. It sounds like we're doubting whether or not this airport can be self-sufficient. And when you see what we've got out there, every airport in the country would die to have what we have here with Duncan, Waco, Western, and a whole west side to develop. This airport will be self-sufficient. I'd like to see the point where we don't have to worry about taxes and getting to the point where that shouldn't even be an issue, because and by getting away from that, it would be more for the city. I just think it's just like we're just underestimating what we have here.
Well, I think I understand the nature of your question. Through our strategic business plan and our rates and fee study, we discovered that we make money leasing land. We make very little money on a fuel flowage fee. We make very little money on landing fees when you look at those revenue sources as a percentage of our budget. So how do we lease land? We become more business nimble. We jump on opportunities and capitalize on those opportunities to continue to develop the land. We'll never be self-sufficient on the back of our existing tenants, and that's not our plan. And so I think the point you're trying to bring home is does the airport have the ability to be self-sufficient? If you look at an average operating subsidy of $500,000 a year out of a $2 million budget, my personal opinion after being here for 22 years is absolutely. And again, it's how do we respond to the market? There's been a lot of opportunities the last 22 years. We haven't seen a lot of growth. We have a period of time coming up where we're having more opportunities than we could ever imagine. And so it's, in my mind, this process is not about how do we find out who's going to pick up the dime for the airport. It's about how are we going to be more efficient? How do we move quicker in the market that demands quick responses? And I think I personally have an answer, but
I don't disagree with either of those statements, but while we're at it, those things that you outlined, creating a regional authority, aspects of those, they all fold into creating a community authority. You don't have to levy a tax, even though you have a community authority. You can still achieve those items. So I don't want to be brought back around the table in 5 years and say, gee, I wish we'd have, thought a little further out so that if we needed it, I think we all believe this can be self-sustaining, but you might as well have the extra tool in your toolbox. And again, that's why I'm saying we should explore it.
Yeah, no, this is great discussion. That's the whole point of this, is to get when we're all drinking from a fire hose right now. This is a lot of information. And we don't want to come back. We don't want to see this in 5 years and say, gee, I wish we would have. So I think what needs to happen is Stephen Baldwin Associates, they need to understand what this group, what additional information do you need to hear about the options that you think we should continue to explore.
So this is Kara. My thing is you talked about Traverse City and they were in a model and then they switched to another model. That hasn't been that long since they had to do the, oops, we better go back to the table. Like Joe is talking about, we don't want to have to do that. So I guess maybe for me, I would want to know what made them get to that point with the model that they originally chose. Is there a reason why they said this model doesn't work or this was an issue? I think that would be important. And I get that they have passenger travel that goes through there and it causes some stuff, but there's also, political climate, those types of things. And was it something along the lines of that rather than, I don't know. I guess I would want to know what situations created those folks to change their model once they had already gone down that path.
Sure. And I don't think go ahead.
I don't think that a community authority is a bad opportunity. Like Joe said, I think that all of those kind of get into that model, but I think that, and while we all think it's self-sustaining, I also know that I am not immortal and I will not be here forever. And I need to be thinking about what those people 50 years from now, when none of us are here in leadership roles, not in the physical world, but, looking at it of, are we putting the airport in the best physical light that we possibly can?
Sure.
And I know that we can go back to the table in that time frame, but I think we have to be thinking about what's going to be of this airport in 50 years. What is the best model to get us to where we want to be in 50 years? I agree. I think we are self-sustaining, or that we can be, and that we can do that. I just really think that that's an option that we need to be thinking about.
Sure. Well, and I would say this. I don't think there was an oops with Traverse City. I think,
Yeah, there wasn't. Larry, do you mind if I answer that quickly?
Yeah,
And,
I think the thing I'm interested in, Penny, is how long had they been in authority with a board with the two counties, and then it wasn't until Act 95 came that they could even do what they're doing.
Right. So they had been with the two counties. Spencer, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was from the mid 70s. So they had the two county commission structure for a very long time. And what they found was, when we came in to review things, one, some of their original agreement documents were they didn't comply with FAA standards. So that was one thing. They were going to have to, update their original documents to reflect current FAA policy. But the thing that really motivated them, Kara, I would say, and this is very relevant to Battle Creek, what motivated them was when they started to develop their land property, when they started to look for additional non-aeronautical revenue, and they ran into enormous hassles with the city and the city being in charge of the zoning laws. And it was a very much of a damper, and didn't allow them to be able to develop the property in the way that is most beneficial for the airport. So by creating a regional authority, that includes that zoning ability for a property. And that was really the main motivating factor. It allowed them to be more entrepreneurial. And it coincides with exactly what Larry was saying, that they can make money from leases. And Battle Creek has relatively an enormous amount of land to take advantage of in terms of development. So a regional authority would give you zoning control.
So Penny, I think that statement right there answers a lot of what Andy was talking about. Andy, please correct me if I'm wrong, in regards to that business model that we talked about with those plans and wanting to know what is the business model that we need, understanding that the regional airport authority has the zoning control so that it doesn't have to go through more red tape with the city is going to be very important in making us entrepreneurial with the airport itself. But I think that statement that you said does lend a little bit more insight into how that might be a better model.
And
in
we
my
have, right. And I would caution you, yes, absolutely explore the community authority if that's an avenue you want to go down. But I want to caution you again, we have worked with other airports who have that model. And again, in terms of property and ownership and development and who benefits from that, it has become quite contentious in other situations that we have been called into as a consultant.
Right.
So
If you
again,
support each other, you're going to be asked to give back to each other, right?
yes.
And so that's the complication. When I talk, and Kara, you're absolutely right about, the business model or business case for each one of these. Those really need to be built out, and not just current state, Larry, but I would also say future state per the strategic plan, which includes development of the west side. Now I know nothing is certain, right? The future is far from certain, but I think you have to have at least that part of the business case that strategically, we need to have that land developed in the next 5 to 10 years. And then how does that change the complexion of this self-sustaining model?
Thank you, Annie. I just need to interrupt for a moment. I actually have to leave because I have another meeting at 2:30, but Spencer and Alex can stay on if you want to continue the discussion. But unfortunately, I have to jump off to go to another meeting at 2:30.
Thanks, Penny.
Yeah.
We're running a little long anyway. We gotta start wrapping this up. So we need some marching orders.
Yes.
Had some, but we had a really good discussion. Now I'm actually now unclear what our marching orders are, other than trying to figure out some financials to present us with respect to it looks like 2 governance models, number 2 and 4. Is that what the committee is recommending?
I thought we said 1, 2, and 4.
Yeah, I don't think you want to exclude 1 because that's
okay.
That is as far as best business practices right now. That's what we're seeing around the country. And Andy, I'm going to call over to Lincoln. I believe I know they're an authority, and I think some of those concerns that came up about the change to leases, that might be helpful for a company such as yours to understand. I mean, you're doing business at an airport that's already an authority. How similar is it? But I think the next meeting, we intend on having some of that financial data. Is that right, Spencer?
That is right. We're going to be bringing in Steve Bush, who has done the financial analysis, to help get into some of the more details, financially speaking, of what the airport is today, and with some of the direction that we've heard, and what could it be tomorrow. And we'll take a look at potential opportunities for future development and how adding future development based on leases, how that might affect it. And we can try to forecast that out a little bit as well.
What I hear you saying then is that the next steps in your analysis wasn't necessarily predicated on what models we might choose or not choose.
To an extent, Ted, yes, we have to look at the current financial situation. We're looking pretty much back the past 5 years, and in looking at where the airport has been and how it's grown and changed over time. And then what we can do is try to tie that back to the 3 models you're selecting today and how it could be affected in the future from a change of governance.
Ask you that because I don't want to complicate things. Lance brought up the notion of maybe reducing the models that we are considering based on the discussion that we heard here today. But I guess I would ask the SBA team, what did you see as your next steps going into this meeting? Were you expecting us to reduce the models, or were you just going to move on to your analysis based on the 4 models that we were presented with?
Today, we weren't expecting you to select your model. It would be nice to narrow the scope We're really targeting November to have a clear picture on what model you're going to recommend as a group. That's our target month right now.
So let's reduce it to those threes, 1, 2, and 4.
Sounds good.
All right. Are we done with the governance review, item number 2?
I think it's safe to say you're done with it unless
Okay.
Spencer says otherwise.
Can I
All
just make one comment? Sorry, this is Kelly. I just have one comment or question. When we see the financial analysis and business model, just want to make sure that we're factoring in the capital maintenance, capital improvement plans, because I'm hearing a lot of confidence in self-sufficiency for the operating budget, but it very much does need to include, maintaining the assets, renewing and all of that. So just want to make sure that's part of what we talk about.
Certainly.
Yes, we're looking at it holistically at all of it. Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else? Any other comments from any member stakeholders?
I think Joe had to get off the call.
Yep.
Is he?
All right.
He's off the call. He was going to add something on public comment, but I think he was off the call. So I just want to make sure he wasn't still on.
We'll move on to F. Is there anyone make public? Or anybody? Sound like it? Or anybody else? Any member comment before we get off this Zoom meeting?
I just wanted to congratulate Miles on becoming the president of the Airport Executive Association. That's going to be way to go.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Miles was elected as the president of the Michigan Association of Airport Executives last week at the annual MWE Fall Conference.
Very nice honor. Okay. No other comments. I entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Anyone supporting it?
Support.
Okay. It's been moved and supported. Any comments? Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Thanks, everyone. See you next meeting.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
bye.
Appreciate everybody's time.